to another collection connection from Cyfarthfa Castle Museum and Art Gallery. My name is Christopher Parry and I work in Cyfarthfa. This is a series that's all about looking at objects within our collection at Cyfarthfa and looking at the historical connections to local history and indeed to each other. As today is World Book Day, March the 4th, 2021, we thought it'd be a perfect opportunity to look at an original edition of a book that was conceived and translated and created in Merthyr, and that is the first editions of the Mabinogion by Lady Charlotte Guest. She did the translation work in Dowlais and they were printed in London. Now, why they are so well worn is because these books were actually donated by another person from Merthyr, and his name can be seen on the very rickety cover, bequeathed to Merthyr Tydfil Library by Thomas Stevens. Now, Thomas Stevens, among lots of things, was a chemist and an author and a general, amazingly interesting guy. It would take another whole video to get into Thomas Stevens' history, so we'll leave that for another day. But Thomas Stevens was connected to the setting up and the foundation of Merthyr Tydfil Library Service. Not the modern day one, this is a subscription service that was separate to what would come later and what we know and love today. But these were donated by him upon his death in 1875, so everyone could read and appreciate these amazing Welsh folk stories. Now, Charlotte was fortunate enough to be born into a wealthy family and she was educated to quite a high standard, but from a very, very young age she showed a great aptitude for learning and education and learning different languages and cultures. She was absolutely besotted by learning and educating herself. She even taught herself Arabic, Hebrew and many other languages. She spoke 9 languages in total altogether by the time she would eventually come to Merthyr Tydfil. She's really a historian's dream as well, because most of her life she kept an in-depth journal which essentially gives us a story, a personal story of her whole life, which is brilliant for historians really. But one of the entries in her diary states that improvement of my studies is the great object of my existence. Lady Charlotte would become connected with Merthyr Tydfil in particular when she married Josiah John Guest in 1833. Now, Josiah John Guest ran the Dowlais Ironworks, but he was also Merthyr's first MP. In 1832, when the Reform Act had been passed, he became Merthyr's first Member of Parliament, and it was on those journeys back and forth for his duties as a Member of Parliament in London that he came into contact with Lady Charlotte Guest and her family, and eventually the couple married in July of 1833 and Lady Charlotte came to Merthyr Tydfil. The couple would have 10 children in total, and she even quite melodramatically described herself in her journal as saying, "I am iron now," basically saying that she is part of the iron industry. And she gave her husband the nickname Merthyr in her journal, so when she was referring to Merthyr in her journal, that meant her husband. On arriving in Merthyr Tydfil, he would even give her a tour of the ironworks. Merthyr took me through the furnaces and forges after coffee, and after dinner I saw them cast iron. In the broad glare of the fires from little distance, the workmen formed groups which might yield fine studies for a painter, especially in respect to the lights and shades cast upon their figures. And she was quite right. Many people over the years, and even well into the 20th century in our collection, we have many paintings depicting Dowlais's light and shade area, and it was an inspiration for many an artist. But for Lady Charlotte, she would throw herself into local culture pretty much as soon as she arrived in the town. She even went with Dowlais and Williams, who was a local writer and a schoolmaster, to do excavations, amateur excavations up on Mawler's castle site and find bits of lead and nails and other things and try to figure out what happened on that old Norman castle site atop of Merthyr. She and her husband, primarily spearheaded by her as well and her passion for education, started opening libraries and schools and many different educational facilities in Dowlais and really did the world of good for the education of Dowlais. The one thing she did which informs a massive part of the story of these books in front of me though, is she threw herself into learning Welsh. Pretty much as soon as she arrived in Merthyr Tydfil, she would be taught in part by Mr. Jenkins, a rector up in Dowlais, And gradually through her studies of Welsh and the culture in Merthyr and the history, she came across what she and many others call the story of the Mabinogion. When she found the Mabinogion, she was determined to try and open it up to as big an audience as she could, and the only way that that would happen is if it would be translated into English and picked up by other nations and other nationalities and then translated in turn into different languages. So she set about in 1838 translating these ancient Welsh stories. She translated it herself and funded the publishing of these books herself as well. And the other key thing is this is a bilingual version. So she's bringing the Welsh version and a modern Welsh version of it and an English version together, Welsh being first, English being second. The stories Lady Charlotte Guest published in these volumes of the Mabinogion date back to the 12th, 13th and 14th century. Back then they were transcribed and preserved on old manuscripts. Many years previous to the manuscripts, these would have been stories passed along in oral tradition, just going from town to town, from city to city, to person, until someone eventually took the very shrewd decision and wrote some of these stories down. And in fact, they are arguably the oldest prose story existing in Britain. So leave that sink in slightly. Back in the 19th century, Lady Charlotte Guest in Dowlais house was translating the oldest known prose story in Britain today, really, which is an amazing thing. Whether it's translated into Welsh or English or any other language, this is capturing a massively important cultural part of our heritage in Britain overall, not just Wales. The first book she translated and published came out in 1838. It's probably my favourite story the Lady Charlotte translated, and it's called The Lady of the Fountain. It's an Arthurian story all centred around knights of Arthur's court, and they going out to do different tasks and challenges many years after Arthur's big moments have passed, really. He's an older gentleman as king of the country and all that, and his knights go out, and the story is just astounding. You go from everything from being encountered by the dastardly Black Knight who protects the fountain. You would go through forests with giants who controlled the forest and all the animals within, and you would even see an invisible magic golden ring, which who knows who took that story off, but certainly the gentleman who took that story off borrowed heavily from the Mabinogion stories, as well as many other. These stories, after Lady Charlotte published all her work between 1838 and 1846, so she published 4 branches of the Mabinogion, which are essentially around 11 stories plus the story of Dowlais. They were actually picked up fairly straight away, and they were translated into French, German and many other languages, and that translation into English really opened these stories up to be appreciated around the world and not just in Welsh by Welsh people. In the opening pages of The Lady of the Fountain, there's a dedication as well to her 2 sons, Ivor and Merthyr. It was Thomas Merthyr Guest and Ivor Bertie Guest, and she dedicated this book to them. And I'll read that dedication to you, and it basically says all you need to know about why she did it and how passionate a person she was. My dear children, infants as you are, I feel I cannot dedicate more fitly than to you these venerable relics of ancient lore, and I do so in the hope of initiating you to cultivate the literature of Tydfil, in whose beautiful language you are being initiated and amongst whose free mountains you were born in. May you become early imbued with the chivalric and exalted sense of honour and fervent patriotism for which its sons have been celebrated. And that was written on August the 29th at Dowlais house where they lived. John Guest would eventually die in 1852, and Lady Charlotte actually took over running of Dowlais Ironworks for a short time, which is certainly another story altogether, but she would eventually separate from Dowlais and marry again. She married Charles Schreiber and then became Lady Charlotte Schreiber, and then she left Merthyr in around 1855. But she would keep coming back and forth because even Abermawley School in Merthyr was opened by Lady Charlotte Guest, and she is still heavily connected to the town even though she was no longer here. So it's an amazing thing that Merthyr is so connected to Welsh literary history really through these books and through Lady Charlotte Guest. So thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed having a look back at the Mabinogion first editions and a few other little bits and bobs from our collection. But thank you very much for watching and have a nice day. Hwyl fawr.